When we think of a medieval siege, we picture knights and siege engines trying to bring a castle to its knees. But what about the people who weren't directly involved in the fighting? The peasants living on the castle's lands? Were they attacked too, or were they left alone? In this video we'll explore the fates of farmers, merchants and day laborers, to see what happened to them when their lord's castle came under siege. In the spring of 1453, Sultan Mehmed II attacked Constantinople. The first sign of the Ottoman advance was the forces of the governor of Rumelia, who marched along the coast toward Constantinople as an advance guard. They raided Byzantine villages, burned farms and tore up vineyards, drawing a belt of destruction around the city even before the siege had begun. This tactic wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Raids like these were a common first step in attacks on fortified towns. As historian Clifford Rogers explains, quote, "Farms and properties outside the walls being put to the torch was a usual opening move by besieging armies when they arrived in front of a town. The soldiers were anything but squeamish during these raids. Entire areas were devastated, including unfortified villages and farms." Rogers describes this procedure almost poetically, quote, "Medieval armies normally passed through hostile territory, like a comet through the heavens, with a solid mass of baggage and troops in formation, a loose perimeter of outriders miles from the center, and in between a large cloud of men dispersed to conduct the heavily overlapping tasks of burning, plundering, ravaging, and foraging." These tactics hit the rural population especially hard. After all, it was their farms, fields and supplies that were plundered, destroyed and looted. So, in short, yes, peasants living near a besieged fortress were frequently, if not always, the subject of targeted attacks. This was not merely tolerated, it was considered strategically useful and entirely legitimate. Civilians who supported the defenders by providing vital supplies were considered valid military targets. From a logistical and economic standpoint, these raids served to cut off enemy resources and apply pressure. But what did these attacks actually look like? And how did they affect the people who lived through them? In the Middle Ages, plundering was so commonplace that contemporary historians often don't even mention it. When they do, they usually resort to vague phrases like, "The general invaded the enemy's country and his troops wreaked terrible havoc." Therefore, it is often difficult to know what these invasions actually looked like in practice. A more vivid account appears in a contemporary report of the revolt of 1173 to 1174, during which members of Henry II of England's own family conspired against him. "It was early morning, and the dawn scarcely breaking, when the proud company of knights armed themselves. First, they attacked the town of Belford. They spread themselves out all over the countryside. Some speed into farms and wreak havoc. Some take sheep from their folds, and some set fire to farmsteads. What more can I tell you? Never will a tale of greater loss be told. You could have seen Flemings tying up peasants and leading them off roped together like heathens. Women flee the church, only to be snatched away naked, leaving behind their garments and their valuables. They burned the countryside, but God showed love for these goodly peasants, who had no protection, in that their mortal enemies, the Scots, were not there, for they would have beaten and killed and ill-treated them." End quote. This excerpt paints a striking picture of the brutality of such raids. In a matter of hours, the invading men-at-arms devastated the area around Belford, setting homes ablaze, looting property, driving off livestock, abducting peasants, and assaulting women. The livelihoods of ordinary people were wiped out almost instantly. These raids were typically carried out by light cavalry or light infantry, or even non-combatants. Some armies even had specialized units for this purpose, like the Akinji of the Ottoman Empire. In German sources, they are fittingly referred to as Renner und Brenner, literally runners and burners. This irregular cavalry received no regular pay. Instead, they made their living entirely through looting, raiding, and kidnapping. Before we look at two of the few surviving reports on individual experiences, it's worth exploring the motivation behind these raids, as well as the purpose they served. Tactically, such raids fulfilled several key functions. By devastating, that is, literally emptying or laying waste to the surrounding area, armies achieved three main goals. Soldiers enriched themselves through plundering, the army gathered supplies through foraging, and the enemy suffered serious economic damage. During a siege, sudden raids also served to catch defenders off guard, preventing them from stockpiling supplies or reinforcing the fortress. This caused the stronghold to run out of food and resources more quickly, especially when civilians from the surrounding countryside fled to the castle for safety, overwhelming already limited space and provisions. Looting and pillaging also put enormous pressure on the territorial lord. He was responsible for protecting his subjects. If he allowed the enemy to ravage his lands without resistance, he was seen as failing his duty. In fact, the extent of devastation was often interpreted as a sign of one side's superiority, and by extension, its victory. Those who carried out the plundering were considered the winners, those who endured it, the losers. The greater the destruction, the more decisive the triumph. Naturally, no prince could accept such a situation without a fight. As a result, plundering became a practical tool to pressure a sovereign, sometimes even forcing him to leave the safety of his castle and engage in battle. So, raiding peasants was more than a random act of violence. It was a strategic lever within a larger military plan. Overall, plundering was one of the most important tools in medieval warfare. Cavalry raids, or chevauchées, in which mounted units like the Akinji ravaged enemy territory for weeks, were a common tactic across Europe and left a deep mark on the war experience of ordinary people. Henry V of England is famously reported to have said, quote, "War without fire is as worthless as sausages without mustard." Henry is, of course, the English king who led his men to that incredible victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 during the 100 Years' War. If you want to dive deeper into the 100 Years' War, we can't recommend Bernard Cornwell's The Grail Quest series enough. This is a genuine shout out, by the way, not a sponsored segment. Cornwell's books are meticulously researched, offer fantastic entertainment, and easy to digest background context on the 100 Years' War and history in general. We listen to these constantly, which is why we've been Audible users for 6 years. The sheer size of their library, the easy access for your commute, and their constant new historical recommendations are simply worth the fee. You can actually get a free book and support our channel at the same time by signing up for an Audible trial using our affiliate link. It costs you nothing extra, and when you sign up, we get a small compensation. Think of it as buying us a coffee. The link is easy to find. It's in the description box below or pinned comment right at the top of the comments. Thank you for considering it. And now back to the video. The reason that armies plundered was simple. Damaging the enemy through plundering was often easier and far less risky than facing them in battle or siege. Even a small group of men with little combat experience could cause significant destruction this way. These attacks rarely targeted fortified towns. Instead, they focused on vulnerable villages, settlements and farms, striking a rural population that was usually weakly defended. The fate of individual people often depended on the circumstances and intentions of the invading army. If the attackers were in a hurry, they focused on seizing what they needed by cleaning out warehouses, cellars and barns. If their goal was to inflict the most damage in the shortest amount of time, their most effective weapon was fire. When an army set fire to thatched roofs and ripe grain fields, as in the revolt of 1173, it could destroy entire swaths of land as it passed through. For the peasants caught in these raids, the consequences were devastating. Within hours, they could lose both their livelihoods and their roofs over their heads. When an army had time, or even stayed in one place as during a siege, the plundering often became even worse. Simply put, the slower an army moved, the more thoroughly it looted, and the greater the economic damage it inflicted. Sieges took this to the extreme, since attackers had to resupply over longer periods, deep in enemy territory. To gather enough food, they squeezed every last chicken and bushel of grain from the local population. Soldiers hunted for hidden camps, interrogated prisoners, scoured forests and ponds, rounded up scattered livestock, and more. In short, they turned the enemy's lands upside down, leaving them with nothing but the bitter sting of famine. When an army aimed to cause maximum damage, it sometimes resorted to more elaborate tactics. For example, if the grain wasn't ripe enough to burn, they would simply trample it. They also destroyed irrigation systems or broke through dams. Even hard, backbreaking labor was undertaken. For example, clearing vineyards and olive groves, like the Ottomans did near Constantinople. This often required cutting down trees for days on end. This made the long-term damage even more devastating. For example, during the crusade against the Albigenses, a religious community in southern France declared heretics by the Pope. The Crusaders destroyed the vineyards around Toulouse during a siege. This was especially brutal for the locals, since it takes years for vines to produce a good harvest. They had to watch in despair as the attackers wiped out the work of generations. Beyond the methods and scale of looting, much remains unknown, largely because medieval historians showed little interest in the fate of peasants. One rare exception is Martin Cottbus, a merchant from the village of Bolkenhain, who left behind some vivid accounts of the Hussite Wars. Everything we know about Martin himself comes from a report he wrote in 1444, the year a band of Bohemian warriors attacked his hometown. Martin describes the brutal raid in striking detail. The men plundered the streets, dragged families from their homes, and systematically searched for valuables. They eventually reached Martin's house. Armed guards took up positions in the street, allowing their comrades to ransack the residents' belongings undisturbed and carry off household goods. They turned everything upside down, taking what they wanted and destroying what they didn't. The nightmare only ended when they forced their way into the room of Martin's wife, who had recently given birth and was still bedridden, not out of mercy, but because some of the attackers knew her personally. They then stopped and withdrew, even warning the family to hide in the cellar, as they planned to burn down the town. As in Martin's case, the fate of peasants often came down to chance, and the whims of their tormentors. According to Malte Prietzel, an expert on medieval warfare, those hoping for mercy were almost always disappointed. While medieval texts often speak of a knightly duty to protect the weak, the poor and the women, the historical record tells a different story. In practice, nearly all soldiers engaged in plundering when operating in enemy territory, even Christian armies attacking fellow Christian communities. Often, they didn't even spare churches or monasteries. Attacks were of course especially brutal during wars against people of different cultures or faiths, or those labeled heretics, who were seen as traitor to the faith and could expect no mercy. One striking example comes from a report on the Lithuanian Crusade. In it, the poet and herald, Peter Suchenwirt, describes how a group of knights raided a Lithuanian wedding. Quote, "There was a wedding. The guests came uninvited. They made a dance with the heathens, so that probably 60 of them lay lifeless. Then they set fire to the village, so that the flames flickered high into the air. I swear, I wouldn't have wanted to be the bridegroom at that wedding. The bride would have chased me away with ease." Perhaps the most shocking is not Suchenwirt's description of the massacre itself, but the casual tone with which he recounts it. Under his pen, the brutal attack becomes a playful anecdote. The slaughter of defenseless villagers framed as a bold and even humorous act. There is no trace of remorse, only pride. The peasants living in the area around a besieged castle weren't just occasionally affected. They were often a primary target of the attackers. Looting was a core element of medieval warfare, and the unprotected rural population made for ideal victims. Exactly how these raids unfolded and what happened to the peasants is only known in a handful of individual cases. More often than not, their fate was determined by chance and the whims of their attackers. If they were lucky, they only lost some valuables. If they weren't, they lost their livelihood, their freedom, or their lives. Thanks for watching. Researching and bringing you these lesser-known stories from history takes time and care, and we rely on your support to keep doing it. For just $3 a month on Patreon, you can help us dig deeper into topics like this, and get an early look at upcoming videos, plus a say in what we cover next through our content polls. Your support truly helps keep this channel going.